Good evening all and welcome. Tonight for you I have a topic we haven't done in a very long time. Glitches in reality. It's gonna be a good one, so get comfortable and let the darkness take control. This story has haunted my family for 4 generations. I used to visit my great-grandparents often as a small boy. My great-grandfather was a tall, robust man with a sense of humor that was always youthful and lively. We connected despite the age gap, and I always looked forward to our time together. But one day, everything changed. It was just he and I in the house. My grandparents had gone out, leaving me with him. I remember walking into the living room to find him sitting in his rocking chair. But he wasn't the same. He was eerily still, his expression somber, and the twinkle in his eye was gone, replaced by a deep, unsettling seriousness. I could sense something was off, and despite my usual carefree demeanor, I couldn't help but feel the weight of his silence. At first, I didn't know how to approach him. I was a child, but even then I could feel the unease in the room. Finally, I blurted out, "What's got you all upset, old man?" I always called him that as a joke, but today it felt like a poor attempt at breaking the tension. His face shifted, and a small grin crept back onto his lips, but it was weak, almost as if he was trying to hold something back. "Would you think I were crazy if I told you a story?" he asked. It was unlike him that I immediately took a step back. I hadn't expected something like this. "What's the story about?" "A ghost story." I was a little bit scared. Okay, I said. And then he started with his tale. I grew up with a man called Jeremiah. He lived in a house besides ours when I was a kid. We were best friends all through school, and after high school I joined the military and went off to college. We lost touch for a while, but when I returned home after 6 years in Japan, we reconnected. We decided to go hunting one weekend, something we had done many times before. He paused, the memory clearly taking him somewhere dark. His fingers clenched around the armrest of the chair, and I could feel his unease growing. That morning, something didn't feel quite right. It was subtle, just an uncomfortable feeling in the pit of my stomach. I almost called off the trip, but pushed it aside thinking it was just nerves. Jeremiah felt it too, motion sickness on the drive to the spot. But we tried to shrug it off. The road was winding after all. When we arrived, I noticed something strange. The place didn't look like the way I'd remembered it. There was a clearing I didn't recognize. And the air was too light. My gut was screaming at me to turn around and leave, but I pressed on. I walked into the clearing, and that's when I heard it. Footsteps, breathing. It was close right behind me. The wind picked up, swirling in the direction like it had a mind of its own. And that's when I turned to tell Jeremiah to step back, but he was gone. I called for him. Nothing. I whistled, but there was no response. My heart was pounding and panic set in. I turned and ran back to where we parked, but when I got there, his truck was gone. I could feel my breath catching in my chest as he spoke. I could almost picture it, the isolation, the growing sense of dread. I drove back furious that he'd left without a word. I went straight to his house, but when I got there, his parents were sitting in the living room. I asked them when Jeremiah would be home, but they looked at me like I was crazy. They told me they hadn't a son called Jeremiah, and he was never a part of the family. I was beyond confused. I started looking around. No one knew him. No one had even heard of him. He wasn't in any of my yearbooks. I couldn't find his name anywhere. He let out a chuckle, but it didn't sound like humor. The only evidence I had was the packing list, the one we'd made for the trip. It's old and worn now, but his name is still there, what he was supposed to bring, what we were going to do. But no one, Not a single person could remember him. Jeremiah was gone, like he'd never existed to begin with. Then there was this long pause, and I could feel the weight of his words hanging in the air. His eyes were distant now, and the sadness was palpable. I wanted to say something, but I was speechless, trapped in the same haunted silence he was. Not knowing what to do, finally I hugged him. He seemed lost in his own mind, and I began to worry that he was slipping. When my grandfather came to pick me up, I mentioned to him that I thought my great-grandfather might need more help, that he was losing touch with reality. But then my grandfather stopped me before I could say anything else. "He's not losing it yet," my grandfather said, his voice steady. But there was an odd, almost fearful glint in his eyes. "He's been telling that story since I was a kid. He told it to your dad too. I believe him. Or at least I believe he believes it." Those words unsettled me. My grandfather didn't believe in ghosts or aliens or anything supernatural. So for him to say that, it made my blood run cold. I've never forgotten that story, or the packing list. It's still in my possession, actually, worn with age, but the name Jeremiah remains. A reminder of something that I cannot explain. And as time goes on, I wonder what really happened that fateful day, or that long ago. Did Jeremiah get caught up in some kind of glitch in reality? And get thrown into another world, a parallel universe perhaps, where my grandfather didn't exist? But I trust my great-grandfather's story. Maybe one of you can make more sense of it than I can. I was around 8 years old when this happened. It was a warm summer evening, and I had been invited to my friend's backyard barbecue. Her name was Llewellyn. Llewellyn lived in a house with a large backyard, half of it a wooden patio where the adults gathered, chatting and laughing. The other half a patch of grass where we played. In the far corner of the yard stood a small play tent, stuffed with old toys and blankets, a perfect hideout for us kids. Llewellyn had a next-door neighbor, another little girl our age called Brenda. She would often come over to play, and today was no different. Llewellyn decided to text Brenda to invite her over, and within seconds got a reply that she'll be right over. Llewellyn turned to me and said, "Hold on, I'll go get her." She then left through the pathway that curved around the house leading towards Brenda's home. And then, not even 5 seconds later, Brenda walked into the backyard alone. I had just seen Llewellyn leave for her, but here was Brendan walking in like she had just come from her home. Maybe she couldn't wait and decided to walk over. It was odd, but I didn't think much of it. "Hey, Brenda," I greeted her. We chatted for a minute, and then she turned and crawled into the tent, shutting herself inside. And then, less than a minute later, Llewellyn returned with Brenda. I felt a wave of dread creep up my spine. Brenda, the same girl who had already been here, was now walking in the yard again side by side with Llewellyn. But something was different. Her hair. The first Brenda had worn her hair in a high ponytail, but this one's hair was completely loose, falling around her shoulders. I turned back to the tent, expecting to see the first Brenda step out, maybe laughing, telling me it was some kind of joke. But the tent never moved, and the only exit was the one at the front. There was no secret compartment she could slide through. And bear in mind, I had been just outside the tent the whole time. So there was nowhere for her to go, no magical place for her to vanish to reappear on the other side of the house just moments later. And I watched in stunned silence as second Brenda joined us, acting like nothing was wrong. I never told Llewellyn or Brenda what I saw that day. Not then, not ever. Even now as an adult, I struggled to make sense of it. Did I imagine it? A trick of the light? A lapse in memory? Or did reality falter for that brief time? I was 18 years old when this happened. It was summer, and my mum and I decided to grab some pizza for lunch. We had 2 dogs, Gracie, a 50-pound sweetheart, and Eddie, a 100-pound powerhouse. Before leaving, my mum reminded me to let them outside so that they wouldn't have any accidents while they were gone. They had plenty of shade outside, fresh water, and we'd only be gone for an hour, so it was nothing unusual. An hour goes by and we pull back into the driveway. I went to the back door to let the dogs in. I called them, but there was nothing. That wasn't weird. They weren't the best at listening. So I called out again. Still nothing. Then I tried the "Mum's mad" voice. That one never failed to get them running. But I was met with more silence. A knot tightened in my stomach. I stepped outside and checked under the house. Our home was elevated about a foot off the ground, and despite our efforts to block off the crawl space, the dogs were obsessed with squeezing in there. But when I got to the grate, our blockade was still intact. Now my mum joined the search. We combed the entire backyard. Our yard was enclosed by a 6-foot privacy fence, which was too high for them to jump. There were no holes dug under the fence, and the gate was padlocked, and the 2 side doors leading outside were locked from the inside. They simply couldn't have gotten out. We moved inside. My mum had already searched the house, but I checked again. Every room, every corner, every closet. I looked under beds, behind furniture, in the bathtub, everywhere. Every conceivable nook and cranny was explored. But we came up shy. And these weren't small dogs that could have been easily hidden. This was an 100-pound dog and a 50-pound dog that were now completely gone. Panic set in. The only other explanations left were impossible. Did someone steal them? That wasn't unheard of in our area. Dog fighting rings were common, and Eddie looked like a breed they'd often target. With our stomachs in knots, we jumped into the car and drove around the neighborhood, searching as far as we thought they could have gotten. Nothing. We returned home defeated. The house was locked up tight, just as we had left it. I headed to the backyard, ready to crawl under the house one last time, and my mum went to her room to post about our missing dogs and start making flyers. And then she yells at me to get in. My mum's voice rang through the house with pure panic, and I ran inside and froze. There they were. Eddie was wagging his tail up and down and trotted to me. Gracie followed, stretching like she had just awoken from a nap. I turned to my mother, who looked ghost white. They were there. Just there, she whispered, pointing to their beds. The same beds we had checked over and over again. The room was exactly how it had been left the whole time. Doors locked, windows closed, no way in or out. We have racked our brains for an explanation, but nothing makes sense. Did they glitch out of reality? Jump timelines? Or were they taken and then put back? Which then begs the question of how? They were so calm. None of this makes sense. I'm a 40-something-year-old man from the South, raised Southern Baptist, and my faith has been my foundation for as long as I can remember. But what happened over the last few Sundays has really shaken me to my core. I work part-time overnight security on weekends. It's an easy enough job, usually uneventful. That is until about 4 weeks ago. It was around 5 a.m. on a Sunday morning, just 3 hours before my shift ended, when the phone rang. It was Todd, the guy who relieves me at 7 a.m. every weekend. Hey bud, I'm going to be a few hours late. Car trouble. Yeah, alright, just get here as soon as you can. That threw off my whole day. Normally I drive home, shower, change, and make it to church on time. But with Todd running late, there was no way I'd make it. It's fine, I'll just go to the night service, I told myself. By the time Todd finally arrived, I just wanted to go home and sleep. At about 4 miles from work, I noticed something. A sign on the side of the road. Christ Community Church, 6 miles this way, and an arrow pointing left. I'd never noticed it before, but that wasn't surprising. I didn't take that road during the daytime, really. Why not? Church is church, right? I turned down the narrow country road, which twisted and curved through dense trees. Then I saw it. A white wooden church, pristine, and behind it stood a small, ancient graveyard with headstones, their engravings too worn to read from a distance. But something about it felt odd. I parked and went inside. The interior smelt faintly of old wood and something floral like dried roses. The moment I stepped inside, the congregation turned and looked at me in unison. What immediately caught my attention were their clothes. The men in dark suits, polished shoes, and stiff-collared shirts. The women wore long dresses, lace gloves, and hats adorned with flowers and ribbons and the like. Even the children were dressed in button-up shirts, knee-high socks, polished leather shoes. It looked odd. Especially for me, still in my work uniform. I shook off the discomfort and took a seat near the back. The sermon was beautiful, and the hymns sounded like they'd been sung to perfection, like they'd been rehearsed for years. Once the service ended, the congregation remained rooted in their seats, and the pastor, a lean, tall man with deep-set eyes and a warm but unsettling smile, walked directly up to me. "Welcome, brother. I'm Pastor Paul. We're so pleased to have you here." His voice was smooth. The others stayed seated, their eyes lingering on me. "We have a business meeting this morning," Pastor Paul continued, his smile never faltering. "But we would love to have you join us next Sunday." Something about the way he said it felt more like a command than an invitation. I shook his hand, nodded, and left. The second Sunday, I'm going to be honest, I don't know why I went back, but something about the place pulled me in. When I arrived, the church looked exactly the same. The parking lot was empty when I pulled up, but the pews were filled. And when I stepped in, every head turned in unison. But this time their expression was warmer, as if they recognized me now. Some came up to me, shaking my hand. "It's good to see you again. Are you thinking of joining us?" Their voices soft. The service was the same as last time, similar hymns, sung in perfect harmony, and at the end Pastor Paul greeted me once more, his smile never wavering. "I knew you'd return." Each week it was roughly the same, as church can sometimes be. And they became more welcoming. But there was something in my gut that told me I shouldn't keep going back, which was weird because I'd always gone to church. Then that morning, my pastor Gary called me. He went on to tell me that he'd missed me in church and asked if everything all right. I'd known this man for a long time, so it wasn't unusual for him to be concerned, to make sure nothing had happened to me. I explained the situation with work and how I was just exploring that church for a short time. He asked me the name of the church, and I told him it was Christ Community Church. Then I heard him go, and take a long pause. I asked him what the problem was. He said he wasn't sure, but as far as he knew, that church had disappeared. It had been swallowed by an earthquake over 100 years ago. I laughed over the phone and said that maybe they'd rebuilt it. I said I'd see him again next Sunday, and thanks for the concern, and it was pretty much the end of the conversation. But the next day I couldn't shake the feeling of unease, so I went back. After work I drove to the road where church had been. But when I reached the spot, there was nothing. Just a field with fences and trees that were never there before. Confused, I parked and stepped out the car looking around. It really should have been here. I had no explanation for where this church had gone. I thought maybe it only appeared on Sundays, but I didn't want to tempt fate, and decided never to return. but this incident has kept in the back of my mind for a long time. What the hell was I dealing with? I'm a 28-year-old woman living in Finland, with my husband, 10 years my senior, in my parents' detached house, nestled in the Finnish countryside, surrounded by vast fields and dense forests. My little brother also lives with us. Lately, though, strange things have begun happening. Objects disappearing and then mysteriously reappearing in the same spot, hours or even minutes later. At first, it started with the small, everyday things. Hair ties, keys, the usual suspects. But one incident earlier in the summer really stands out. It was late at night around 1 a.m., and since I'm a night owl, I was in bed watching YouTube, just passing time. I was comfortable, winding down, when suddenly I heard the TV in the living room turn on full blast. The sound was loud. I thought for sure it would wake up the whole house. I jumped out of bed in a panic, thinking maybe one of our cats had stepped on the remote, as this has happened more than once. I grabbed my phone and checked the time. 1:30. Everyone else should have been asleep, but I could still hear the TV clearly. As I walked down the hallway, the sound got louder, and when I reached the living room, my mum was snoring away on the sofa, completely unaware. She's a heavy sleeper, and I couldn't help but wonder how she wasn't stirred by the noise. I flipped on the lights and looked around the room. The TV was blaring some ridiculous commercial at full volume, and there was no way I could turn it down without finding the remote. I began checking every surface, tables, chairs, under the sofa, between the cushions, everywhere, but it was simply nowhere to be found. I spent what felt like an eternity, at least 5 minutes, searching. All the while, the TV blasted ads louder than I could bear. Our TV doesn't have any physical buttons for power or volume, and the power cord was hidden behind a heavy shelf, so I was stuck. Frustrated and slightly embarrassed by the noise, I finally decided to wake up my mum. I nudged her awake and asked her where she'd last seen the remote. Still half asleep, she groggily told me that my dad had left it on the backrest of the sofa. Now, the sofa is L-shaped, with sturdy armrests and backrests that create little alcoves between the cushions, so it seemed strange that it would disappear. But we began searching anyway. We both started flipping through cushions, moving blankets and turning over pillows. My mum even pulled up the sofa's slip cover, thinking it had slipped under it. And that's when something strange happened. One of our cats, a fluffy white thing with a mischievous streak, jumped up on the backrest of the sofa. She walked a few steps forward, when out of nowhere the remote appeared right on the edge of the backrest, exactly where my mum had said it had been last. I saw it happen with my own eyes. The remote didn't just appear from under the cushions or fall from some hidden crevice. It was as if it materialized in front of me. In that moment, I was frozen. I didn't know what to think. Normally when things disappear and reappear, it's subtle. You glance away for a moment and it's gone, or you find it in an unlikely spot after retracing your steps. But this was different. I hadn't missed it. I had checked that exact spot before the cat jumped up. It was as if it hadn't been there and all of a sudden it just appeared. My mum, of course, brushed it off as nothing more than us not noticing it before. She's pretty logical, and in the half-sleep days she didn't think too much of it. But that explanation didn't sit right with me. If it had been just me, maybe I would have bought it. But we were both in the room, searching for the same thing. And it wasn't like I was imagining it. I was wide awake, and the noise from the TV was enough to keep me on edge. And I know it sounds crazy, and I've been trying to figure out a rational explanation. I don't do drugs, the house doesn't have a gas leak or carbon monoxide, we had the place checked and nothing unusual has come up. But every now and again something else goes missing. And when I'm about to give up, it often shows up again in the most unexpected of places. Something strange is happening, and I can't shake the feeling that there is more to it than just a simple mix-up or misplacing things. It feels off, like we're caught in some kind of loop or glitch. I'm starting to wonder if it's not the house that's odd, but reality itself. 3 years ago, on a night when the air felt unusually thick, I drifted into a dream that seemed so real, so vivid, that I struggled to separate it from waking memory. I found myself entering the familiar classroom from my gender and sexuality class at college. It looked like any other day. Sunlight filtering through the blinds, the soft murmur of students settling into their seats. But something in the atmosphere felt off, and a sense of unease washed over me as I walked in. I took my seat next to my friend and waited for the class to begin. My eyes scanned the room idly, the hum of the fluorescent lights above mingling with the faint shuffling of papers. Then my teacher stood up in the front, her voice cutting through the silence. "All right, everyone, I have a surprise for you," she said. Her attempt at enthusiasm was forced, her words almost a tired routine. I could feel her awareness for how mundane this surprise was. She continued, "I thought I might shake things up and have you guys do some group work today." And the class collectively groaned. She began numbering us off, and we split into 5 groups. A strange sensation crept over me, like the room was closing in, and I felt a tightening in my chest. The desks scraped across the floor as we rearranged, and I ended up sitting beside a girl with long brown hair, her rainbow leggings almost glowing in the harsh light. To her left sat a heavy-set guy, his beard thick and unruly, his plaid Scottish cap perched on his head, and I found myself zoning in and out of the conversation. The guy in the cap mentioned Flogging Molly, a band I had never really thought about. But in that moment, the words seemed to reverberate around me. The girl beside him smiled, nodding eagerly. "Yeah, they're great." As if I should have known this. Something about all of this felt weird. Suddenly, the conversation seemed to drag on endlessly, each word sinking deeper into that pit of my stomach. I felt trapped in this loop, the same pattern repeating over and over. I tried to focus, but the room was shifting around me. And then I woke up. My morning. I opened my eyes to the harsh light. It was 9:10, the same hour I had dreamt that I would awake. I tried to grasp the remnants of the dream. It was so real. I could still feel the weight of it on my chest, and the lingering sensation of something being wrong. I had to leave for my gender and sexuality class in an hour, so I rolled out of bed and did the usual morning things: shower, dress, eat, brush my teeth. But I couldn't escape the feeling that something wasn't right. The dream felt too much like a premonition. I caught the bus on time and arrived at class as the doors opened. I sat beside my friends as usual, scanning the room. And then my heart skipped 2 beats. There she was, the girl in my dream, wearing the same rainbow leggings. I tried to brush it off as coincidence. Maybe she'd worn them before and I'm just noticing it again. And the guy in the Scottish plaid cap as well, sitting next to her. He looked almost identical from the guy in the dream. Deja vu gripped me hard. It was the same class, the same work, the same everything. My teacher stood up at the front, giving the exact same speech that she had in my dream. She numbered us off and I found myself in the same group as the girl with the rainbow leggings and the guy in the cap. The conversation started slow and unremarkable, but then, like in my dream, the topic turned to music and someone casually mentioned everyone's favorite band. And suddenly, Flogging Molly came up again. The girl beside him nodded, and the same discourse happened. I sat there, throat dry, the weight of the moment crushing me. What exactly is happening here? The conversation drifted away, but my mind raced. I said something to interrupt the flow. I don't remember what. People looked up at me for a moment and carried on their conversation. The feeling of panic stayed with me. And then I reached the point that wasn't in my dream. Things that happened after, if it would have continued. Class ended, and I left the room quickly, trying to escape the weight of it all. And after a while, the strange feeling subsided, and life went on as normal. but it left me with a deep-seated fear. What was that all about? Did I manage to dream my mundane class and what it would be like? Or was there maybe some kind of glitch in our reality, and I had my morning class played for me early in my head? I'm not sure. It's left me with many questions and no answers, and if anyone can help, I'd be grateful. I live in Wisconsin, where the summers are nice but the winters are brutal. When it snows, it really snows, and when it's cold, it's really cold. On this particular day, my brother had come to town. He works out of town and frequently travels from state to state, and he's not home very often. I picked my brother up from the airport. He was staying at my mum's house for the weekend, and then I had to drive him to another town the next day so that he could fly out of there and head to his next destination. After he arrived at my house, it started to snow. We weren't really worried about it since it snows all the time. Like I said, I've driven in plenty of snowstorms and whiteouts, so I'm used to driving in the snow, so it's never been something that I feared to do. I would honestly rather not drive in the rain than the snow, that's how used to it I am. The roads get very bad here, they get very slippery. We get black ice and all kinds of conditions to make it more difficult for people to drive in. So that Monday, my brother needed to get home, but it was snowing really bad. I didn't really want to have to drive an hour away on the roads that I had to drive on, particularly because they were straight roads where you didn't get to stop for miles, and it was later in the day. But I knew my brother needed to be back home, so I decided I would take him. At first, everything was fine. My brother drove for the first 20 minutes, but then things started getting bad. I could feel him tensing up behind the wheel. You could barely see past the windshield as the snow pelted us from every direction. I suggested we pull over and switch drivers. We stopped at a small, seemingly random side road. There were no other cars on the road, and everything was dead quiet except for the howling wind. My brother quickly jumped out to use the bathroom. He couldn't hold it any longer, and while he was gone, I glanced around. The snow was falling heavier now, and I noticed something odd. There was a sign on the side of the road that I hadn't seen before. It was a large wooden sign with a faded design that said, "Welcome to Woolwich. Here, time is always on your side." It struck me as an odd sign for a town. Who would want something like that on a sign? Felt like a strange phrase, and my gut told me something was off about it. What does that even mean? I shrugged it off and didn't think too much of it at the time. We were both distracted by the worsening snowstorm. After my brother finished, we hopped back in the car. I was driving now, and the snow had turned into something worse. It wasn't just falling anymore, it was swirling, almost like we were driving through a snow vortex. The wind picked up in a strange, unnatural way, pulling the snow into a spiraling tunnel around the car. It felt like we were entering another world. I couldn't see more than a few feet ahead, and everything around us was a blinding white. I was getting uneasy but didn't want to stop. Pulling over in conditions like this could be dangerous, especially with no other cars around, so I pressed on, determined to get him to his destination. So we finally reached his drop-off. It was already dark around 7 p.m, and he asked if I wanted to stay, but I wasn't leaving. "No, I've got to get home. The weather's too bad, I'll get going now," I said, still feeling off. So I left, hoping I could push through to get home safely. I got in my car and set my GPS. The time on my phone said it was 7 p.m. on the dot, and I started driving. The roads were still bad, but I'd driven those roads before, and I kept a steady pace, going at around 25 miles an hour, knowing I'd have to account for the slow travel due to the snow. Even though the snow was falling heavy and the roads were slippery, it was a familiar route, so I figured I'd be home in just about an hour. But as I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The wind howled louder now, and the snow was coming down so hard it almost felt like I was driving through a dream. I kept checking the time on my phone, but it felt like time was moving differently. Every time I checked, it felt like only a minute had gone by. When I finally pulled into my driveway, I looked at the clock, and it said 10:30 p.m. But that didn't make sense. I had dropped my brother off at 7, just over an hour away, and had driven at a reasonable pace. How'd it take me 3.5 to get home? I couldn't account for the lost time. I wasn't speeding or doing anything out of the ordinary. The roads were bad, sure, but not that bad. I kept thinking about the sign. Here, time is always on your side. And when I tried retracing my steps, I'd never seen the sign again. Or that town, or any mention of it. I checked my GPS, Google Maps. Nothing. I can't say for sure what happened, but I can tell you that something strange happened that night. Whether it be a time distortion, glitch in reality, or something else entirely, I don't know. But I do know one thing. Something was off, and I'm the only one who felt it. I'd like to tell you a story of something weird that happened back in high school. It was summer, and we were celebrating my dad's birthday. To mark the occasion, we drove about 2 hours to a casino to watch a boxing match with my uncle. The match ended late, and we decided to drive back home that same night. Big mistake. We were getting close to home near this canyon where there's absolutely no phone reception, so we called my mum to let her know we'd be home soon. The canyon usually takes about half an hour to pass through, especially late at night with no traffic. It was around midnight, and we were all pretty tired, but we kept the conversation going to stay awake, talking and telling stories, mostly creepy ones trying to scare each other. As we continued driving through the winding roads, time seemed to blur. It was one of those moments where everything felt a little surreal, and the hours seemed to melt away. After what felt like an eternity, we passed this same butte in the canyon. The instant we passed it, I got a strong sense of déjà vu. I was sure we had already passed it before. My dad, uncle, and I had driven through this canyon 100 times, so we knew it like the back of our hand, but I was certain. We kept talking, trying to shake off the strange feeling, but then it happened. We passed the exact same butte again. I froze, suddenly aware that something was seriously off. I pointed it out, and my dad and uncle both noticed it too. But it wasn't just the oddity of the same butte, it was the time. I glanced at the clock and it said 1 a.m. We were still nowhere near home. We all exchanged looks. That should have been impossible. The canyon wasn't that long, and we'd driven this route countless times. How could an hour have passed so quickly? We all fell silent after that, the mood shifting from casual to something darker. It was like the world had slowed down and we were watching the road pass by, feeling like something wasn't right. Time didn't seem to be following its usual rules. It was like we were trapped in some kind of loop, just repeating the same stretch of road over and over again. As we finally exited the canyon around 1:15, the feeling of dread didn't leave us. We called my mum again and she picked up almost immediately, sounding frantic. She'd been waiting for our call but hadn't heard anything for a long time. It was only then that we realized just how much time we'd lost. That extra 45 minutes, or however long it was, just seemed to vanish. We had no explanation for it. The roads hadn't been blocked, we hadn't been stopped anywhere. It was as if we had just slipped through a crack in time. To this day, we still can't figure out what happened. There's no rational explanation for the missing time, and it still creeps us out when we talk about it. Maybe it's just a weird coincidence, or maybe something else happened that night that we'll never truly understand. My first glitch in the Matrix experience occurred during my freshman year at the University of California, Santa Barbara in 2000. To this day, I can't explain it. This was something that still haunts me whenever I think about it. Before diving in a bit of context, I attended UCSB from 2000 to 2004. I was a studious, introverted type. Someone who avoided spending money and probably used every last credit on my meal plan. As a bookish student, I spent countless hours at the Davidson Library, a place that became my second home. By the end of my first year, I had studied on nearly every floor from the quiet spaces to the breathtaking Pacific view room on the 8th floor. The glitch happened in October of 2000, right after I had finished a couple of midterms. The stress of exams was getting to me, and I couldn't study in my dorm room. It felt like just a bedroom, not a place of productivity. And after taking 2 midterms over the course of 2 days, I met up with my roommate for lunch at Ortega. After we parted ways, he was heading to his shift at the bookstore, and I was off to the Davidson's library to prepare for the rest of my exams. I entered through the Davidson entrance, the main entrance at the time, and headed straight for the ocean elevators, the set of 3 elevators that serviced all 8 floors to the library tower. I pressed the button for the 8th floor and stepped into the middle elevator, which opened immediately. I pushed the button and waited for the elevator doors to close. It took only a few moments, and soon I was on my way up. When the doors opened, I stepped out onto the 8th floor. But something was very wrong. Instead of the familiar library floor, I was standing on an exposed concrete slab, with bags of masonry material and construction equipment scattered around. The area was clearly under construction. There were no walls, no windows, just raw concrete, an open space. I stepped back into the elevator and checked the floor number, still the number 8, with a downward arrow. Confused, I stepped out again, unsure of what I was seeing. I walked to the edge of the floor, looking westward towards the horizon, expecting the familiar view of the campus below. But instead I was greeted by an unsettling sight. The sun was setting, right then. This shouldn't have been happening. It was only around 1 p.m. when my roommate and I had left the dining commons. The sun wasn't supposed to set for hours. My mind raced as I looked down at the Usen near the campus lagoon. There was something missing. Stork Tower. The bell and clock tower visible from almost every part of the campus was nowhere to be found. I stared in disbelief, wondering how I could possibly be overlooking something so prominent. It was as though it had never existed. Turning to my right, I saw something even stranger. The snow-capped peaks of the Santa Ynez Mountains, but it was October, and no snow had fallen yet in Santa Barbara. Not to mention that snow never blanketed the local mountains this early in the season. As I tried to make sense of this, a small plane emerged just from below my field of vision, ascending from the local airport, and I watched it until it disappeared from sight. When I looked down at the rooftop of the original 2-story library, I felt the unsettling weight of disorientation. I looked south towards the Pacific Ocean, and in the distance I saw Santa Cruz Island, the westernmost of the Channel Islands rising out of the sea. But the floor of the library should have been far from this view. Confused, I tried shaking off the mounting sense of dread, but I looked down again, something even more shocking happening. The 4-story wing of the library, which had been built just south of the tower, was completely missing. In its place were rows of bicycle racks stretching all the way over to the edge of the library tower. Something was very wrong, and I had no idea how to process it. At this point, I realized that the elevator doors had been open the entire time, and I needed to get out of there. This didn't feel like a glitch in the library. It felt like I had been somehow transported to the past, the time when the library tower was still under construction and before Stork Tower even existed, and before the current layout of the library was even conceived. I quickly turned around and walked back towards the elevators, my heart pounding in my chest. I pressed the down button, desperate to go back to reality. When the doors closed and I descended, I felt the sensation of time slowly catching up with me, and by the time I reached the 1st floor, everything was back to normal. The library's familiar features had returned. Stork Tower was standing tall in the distance, and I stepped out of the elevator, taking a deep breath. I walked past the payphones and dorms and phone areas, relieved to find myself back in the present, and quickly made my way to the exit. As I stepped outside, I noticed the time was exactly the same as when I entered the library, just a few minutes after noon. But there was a chill that lingered down my spine as I walked towards the Usen, unable to shake the memory of what I had experienced. Later that evening, I met my roommate at dinner and shared the story with him. He was skeptical at first, but eventually believed me. My recollection of the events was so vivid and sincere that he couldn't dismiss it. Since that day, I've been back to the 8th floor of the Davidson Library countless times, showing friends and family around the campus. But I've never had that strange experience again. Every time I rode the elevator up to that floor, I secretly hoped the doors would open to an unfinished library with missing landmarks. But each time it was just a memory of something I couldn't quite explain. A few years ago, I was making the long drive back from Georgia to Arkansas, a familiar trip I'd done countless times. It usually takes me through the northern part of Alabama, and there's one rest area I always stop at. It's quiet, isolated, and a bit eerie, but it's a place I've come to rely on that breaks up the drive. I pull into the rest area around 1:30. The world outside my car bathed in the eerie stillness of the night. After a long drive, I was exhausted, so I decided to take a quick nap. I figured I'd rest for a bit, then stretch my legs and grab a Red Bull from the vending machine to wake myself up before getting back on the road. I got out of the car, did my business, grabbed my drink, and climbed back into the driver's seat. The entire place was dead quiet. No cars, no people, just the soft hum of the vending machines in the background. As I pulled out of the rest area and got back on the highway, I couldn't help but notice how empty the road was. It was a late hour, sure, but I've always seen at least a few trucks or cars, especially on a highway like this. This time, though, it felt different. The highway stretched out before me, empty and silent, the darkness pressing in on me from all sides. It was almost unnerving. I shrugged it off, focusing on the road, the familiar hum of the engine the only sound accompanying me. It wasn't long before the eerie quiet seemed to settle into my bones, but I kept driving, trying to shake the feeling. The next thing I know, it was nearly 6 a.m., and the first lights of dawn were creeping over the horizon. I had been driving what seemed to be only a few minutes, but somehow hours had passed. My heart sank as I looked down at my fuel gauge, which was nearly empty. I had left the rest stop with a nearly 3/4 tank and now was nearly out. I checked my odometer. I had driven over 250 miles. But my GPS? It said I was only about 10 minutes away from the same rest area I had just left. And I felt a chill run through me. That wasn't possible. I knew that stretch of highway like the back of my hand. The math didn't add up. My mind was racing as I tried to wrap my head around it. There was no way I could have driven 250 miles and moved only 10, according to my GPS. The gas tank, the odometer, the GPS, none of it made any sense. The time, too. I had no recollection of the hours lost. It was like they'd just been erased. I glanced around, my eyes darting over the empty highway, the pale light of dawn now fully breaking across the landscape. Everything looked the same as when I had first left the rest stop. The highway was still deserted, no cars, no signs of life, and a sinking feeling crept up my spine. And for the first time on that trip, I felt a heavy, creeping unease settle over me. I pulled over to the side of the road, gripping the steering wheel as my mind tried to make sense of what had just happened. But nothing did. The world felt wrong, like I had crossed some boundary, and now I was stuck in some distorted version of reality. My heart raced, and the hair on the back of my neck stood up. I had to keep driving, I had no choice. I couldn't explain the time loss, the empty highway, the strange shift in reality. But I knew one thing for sure. Something had happened. I pressed the gas pedal and continued down the road, but the unease never left. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't the only one driving that highway. Whatever happened to me, I wasn't sure, but I knew I wasn't the same person who had pulled out of that rest stop a few hours ago. This happened back in 2006 when I was 16. I was working at a chain pretzel shop at my local mall. It was summer and the days dragged on, especially during the dead afternoons where barely anyone came by. Since it was slow, only one person was needed to run the small satellite store downstairs. The main store was upstairs, and I was responsible for managing the pretzel stand and the small ice cream kiosk attached to it. On this particular day, I was the unlucky one left to man the ghost town. Without any windows to let the natural light in, it felt like time stood still. The only way I kept track of time was by the occasional glance at the clock or the distant echoes of mall announcements. To make things worse, the upstairs store had cameras pointed at us at all times, so sneaking in a quick text or zoning out was practically impossible. I just stood there bored out of my mind, waiting for anyone to give me something to do. Then out of nowhere a family of 3 appeared. A mother, a daughter, and a young boy stood a short distance away from the counter, silently staring at me and the pretzels. I wouldn't have thought much of it except something was off. They looked like they had stepped straight out of the 1950s. The mother wore a modest dress with a clinched waist, her hair styled in that vintage polished way. The daughter had a similar old-fashioned dress, and the little boy was the strangest of all. He had neatly combed hair, suspenders, and shoes that looked like something a kid from a black and white movie would wear. I blinked, wondering if I was imagining things. My first thought is that they had just come up from the professional photo studio upstairs. They did theme portraits all the time, so maybe the family had just been taking some 1950s style pictures. That was the only logical explanation I could come up with. The boy, who couldn't have been more than 6 or 7, approached the counter and asked for a pretzel. I told him it was $2.66. He reached into his pocket and handed me a single dollar bill. I glanced at the bill, ready to ask his mum for the rest, but froze. The dollar wasn't an ordinary dollar, no. It was a silver certificate, series 1957. At first I thought I was mistaken, but I stared at it harder. It was real. But what really freaked me out was that the bill didn't look like it had been circulating for the past 49 years. It wasn't pristine, and it had the normal wear and tear of modern currency, like something that had just been used recently. If I had gotten that bill as change earlier that day, I wouldn't have thought twice. Confused, I looked up at her and told the mother the pretzel was $2.66, and she was $1.66 short. Her reaction was unsettling. She stared at me like I had just told her the pretzel cost a fortune. Her expression wasn't just one of surprise, it was bewilderment, like she didn't understand how money worked in this era. The little boy remained silent, just standing there. He kept holding out the dollar like it was all he had. Something wasn't right. I handed the dollar back to the boy. I wasn't even thinking about the money anymore, I just wanted them to leave. And he took it and walked back to his mum and sister, and they walked away without another word. That's when I realized something stranger. No one else had crossed their path. The mall wasn't packed, but it wasn't that dead. The music and media store next door, which was usually buzzing with teenagers during the summer, was oddly quiet. Even the usual background noise of distant conversation and footsteps seemed muted, like the entire space was different. They were just gone. I didn't see them again after that. And when I finally managed to convince my manager to let me review the security footage, things only got weirder. The camera showed me standing at the counter, talking, but you couldn't see the family. No one was there. The angle was just wide enough that you should have been able to see them, but there was nothing. I was clearly interacting with someone, talking and gesturing like I would with any customer, but there was no one visible. To this day, I have no explanation for what happened. I've told this story countless times, and people always offer theories, time slips, residual hauntings, maybe just an elaborate prank. But none of that explains the dollar. That silver certificate was real. And sometimes when I think about it, it leaves me wondering. Did I unknowingly serve a family that was never supposed to be there? Or was I the one who wasn't supposed to be there? When I was 15, we went to my friend's house for a party. His house was on the outskirts of our small town in rural Ireland, miles away from anyone else. It was the kind of isolated place where you could almost feel the quiet of the land. No traffic, no noise, just fields for miles. It was the late 90s, and we were all the typical 14 to 15-year-olds living for the usual beer, music, and laughter, and of course the company of girls. We were camping out in his front garden, in a tent we had set up beside the house. The field next to the garden was a hangout for the night. We had decided to light a fire with some old wood and timber we found scattered around. It took some effort, but after a few false starts, we finally managed to get it going. There we were, sitting around the fire, passing around cans of beer, laughing, joking, and acting like typical teens. Then William, the one whose house we were at, suggested we go to the fairy fort. His tone was playful but also slightly serious, as it was an idea we couldn't pass up. We all agreed to go, not thinking much of it at the time. It was only a 10-minute walk through a field, he said. Now here's the thing about a fairy fort. In Irish folklore, these are no ordinary mounds. They're ancient earthwork circular hills surrounded by trees shrouded in overgrowth. If you've ever seen one, you know it's not a natural formation. It's clearly man-made, a relic from an ancient past. But what makes them even more mysterious is the belief that they're sacred places of power, where spirits and fairies dwell. So we left the campfire, though not before a few of my friends stomped on it, kicked it, and urinated on it, ensuring it was completely extinguished. Laughing and joking, we made our way across the fields. The night was warm, the stars were out, and everything seemed pretty normal until we reached the fairy fort. The place felt strange from the moment we crossed its boundary. It's hard to explain, but imagine walking into a dense thicket of trees, stepping onto a circular mound of earth where the air suddenly feels heavier. Even though it was midsummer, it felt like we had stepped into the heart of winter. The temperature dropped immediately. The atmosphere grew thick and suffocating, like something was pressing down on us. I remember the silence, the kind that feels unnerving. We stood there for a few minutes, goofing around, trying to shake off the eerie feeling. But one by one, my friends started to feel it too, the sense that we shouldn't be there. It was almost like the land itself was repelling us. William, the one who had suggested the fairy fort in the first place, was the first to say, "Nah, this is crap, let's head back," and everyone agreed without question. We quickly turned around to leave. The walk back felt hurried, like something was following us, urging us to move faster, and as we neared the campfire, one of my friends shouted, "Look, it's still going!" We all stopped dead in our tracks, staring at the flickering light in the distance. It was impossible. We'd left it extinguished, completely out. Yet here it was, roaring like nothing had happened. There were no other people around, no one had come by and reignited it. The fire was exactly the same as when we left it, tall, vibrant, and full of life. That's when the confusion set in. We were all moving fast towards the fire at a faster pace now, hearts pounding, each step feeling more urgent than the last. We were being drawn into something we didn't understand, and then as we got closer, there it was, exactly as it had been before. The fire hadn't been disturbed, the embers hadn't been touched. It was like time had been frozen and nothing had happened at all. Pure silence followed. None of us could speak. The realization hit all at once, and we knew it. It defied all logic, all ounce of reason. We stared at the fire for what felt like an eternity, and in that moment it was like the world around us had stopped. In a daze, we sprinted back to the tent, not saying a word to each other. There was no need. We all were thinking the same thing. It was as though we'd crossed into something we weren't meant to understand or supposed to exist. When we got to the tent, we tried to explain it away, like maybe a farmer had come by and restarted the fire while we were gone. But we'd only been gone for about 20 minutes. The fire should have been nothing but dying embers by the time, not a roaring fire like it had been. One of my friends was so shaken by what we had witnessed that he called his mother to pick him up. He left, terrified. We never spoke of it again. Not really. It's one of those things that's impossible to explain, something that, unless you've experienced it, you would never believe. But I'll never forget it. I can still see the fire burning, as though time had no power over it, as if we had stepped into something far beyond our own understanding. And there you have it. I hope you enjoyed tonight's glitch video. If you did, be sure to let me know down below. It means a hell of a lot. And if you'd like to support me even further in my spooky endeavors, feel free to check out my membership page or Patreon. The links to both can be found in the description, with cool respective perks like your name here at the end and other stuff if you want to find out more. But that's it from me. More videos on screen now, and until next time, stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one. Good night.